I'm the owner of Atlantic Charter Insurance Group. Been in business about 22 years. We're up on the boulevard. Been here all my life. I'm a lifelong resident of Virginia Beach. And let's start off. Who knows anything about flood? Just raise your hand if you think you know anything about flood.
Floods or flood insurance?
About flood insurance.
Well, the
Okay.
normal stuff.
What do you know? Tell me what your perceptions are. What do you think the program was designed for?
When the house floods, you call quick.
Okay.
It's a government subsidized program
Mhm.
for people in certain floodplain areas.
Who's in a flood zone?
Everybody, it just depends on which one.
That's great. All right, there are 3 zones you really have to look out for on anybody's policy. AE is your principal one, and it can be an AE, A1, A2, A3, A4, A5, A6, A7. There's even an AA. That's usually in Hampton, over towards Pocosin, where if you buy a house there, you might just buy water wings. It's always flooding over there. There's also BC and X, which are your preferred zones. Those are the 2 zones that you don't need to know most about. A zones, BC and X. BC and X are preferred because they're the least likely to flood in any place. And the last zone is a V. Does anyone know what a V is?
Top of
I've
a
never
mountain.
seen that.
Top of a mountain.
Or the bottom of a valley.
Right, exactly, bottom of the valley, or reverse, yeah, top of the mountain. If any of you guys have ever sold property all along Shore Drive, very close to the bay, that's all been remapped as V. Or along Atlantic Avenue, along the oceanfront avenue, that's all V too. It's called velocity. And what that means is it's wave action, and it comes in and it destroys and removes. So the purpose of flood insurance, just to give you a little background, in 1968, the Congress authorized the flood with the Flood Protection Act because the federal government noticed that these Midwestern floods, especially in various areas of Colorado, of Nebraska, all these different places that had water plains that all along the Mississippi, they were flooding out. Insurance companies ran from these policies because floods are unpredictable, they're immediate, and they are devastating. I mean, in other words, when you get 18 to 24 inches of water in a house, more than likely the house is going to have serious structural damage and have to be torn down or structurally altered to the point where you're down to just the sticks, bricks, and mud. So in '68,
Mud literally.
oh yeah, it would be sticks, bricks, and mud.
Mud literally though. The
Oh,
mud is
absolutely.
in the house.
I can give you guys for about in 1998, it was the year after my daughter was born. My dad, my stepfather, my natural father, lived in Alabama, a little town called Atmore. It's 45 minutes from Pensacola Beach. Hurricane Opal hit Pensacola Beach dead on. Did a lot of tremendous devastation there. But as it marched forward, one of the bands produced 36 inches of rain in 2.5 hours. It was just that, I mean, it was like you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. It was raining so hard. My dad suffered 24 inches of water in his house. He was in an unincorporated area, which means he did not subscribe to the National Flood Insurance Program, and it did not have any way for him to buy flood insurance in there because it's an unincorporated entity and not subject to the National Flood Insurance Plan. His damage on his house, one-story ranch, was a little over $36,000. And he only had 16 inches of water in the house. He was able to keep most of it out using pumps and stuff like that. And as it was, he had to pretty much rebuild that part of his house through government loans and loans from his son. It does happen, and it's very quick when it happens. It's sudden. Definition of a flood. Let me guys give you the definition of a flood. Definition of a flood is 2 adjacent properties that flood. It's not one. So if you're living on a lake and you're the only person on the lake and it floods, flood insurance isn't going to help you. It has to be 2 adjacent properties. And that could be another thing too here. Let's say, for instance, you have a property that has a fire plug on the arc, and the fire plug fails, now, just doesn't work right. And water comes gushing out of that thing and inundates both yards, into the point where it gets into their houses. That's considered a flood. Rains real hard. Your neighbor and you both flood, it's a flood. But if your neighbor doesn't flood, and your land is low lying, and you just thought you were going to be covered, you're not going to be. It has to be 2 adjacent properties. That's federal law. Now, everybody can purchase flood insurance. There's no reason why you can't, even if you've had successive losses. Let's say, for instance, you've had a property and it has had multiple floods. You can still purchase flood at the same rate that you would have purchased it before, except for preferred. The qualifier for preferred flood is that you must have less than 2 incidences over the last 3 years. If you've had more than 2 floods and then you fall into the regular program, it's a little more expensive.
Less than 3 in 2 years?
Less than 2 in the last 3 years.
2 in 2 years.
Yes, ma'am.
What about your stepfather? Could he get it now in the
Yeah.
unincorporated area?
Yes, they have since joined the NFIP because they had
No,
never.
but if you're not in an incorporated area.
If you're not in an incorporated area, you cannot get flood insurance until the area gets.
I can see that you wouldn't be required to get it, but you couldn't voluntarily get it?
Couldn't even get it because here's what the NFIP says. Hey Donna, how are you? The NFIP says is that if you're not willing to subject yourself to federal scrutiny, to come up with a way to deal with floodplain management, to deal with flood runoff waters, and things like that, then you're not a subscriber to their program. In other words, you could just jump in and have a multiple number of floods because you're not doing anything to proactively deal with it. They won't allow you the program. You cannot purchase it through the government, no, at all.
But wait, one more question,
Yes, ma'am.
follow up.
Go ahead.
You could purchase it, but it wouldn't be the government subsidy.
You can potentially get it from a Lloyd's of London carrier, what we call an excess surplus lines carrier. For example, are you guys familiar with Lloyd's of London? Do you know what it is?
Yeah.
Okay, well Lloyd's has these various syndicates that come up with money and they pony it up, and they will say, well, we'll write flood up to a certain level. But they'll do it based on what the floodplain management looks like. And if it's not been a good history, they won't write it at all, and therefore you'll be unable to get it at all. Now, in the case of this scenario, my dad was in a small town that had never had a flood. Never, ever, ever. And of course, in their 45, sorry, well, I should turn mine off. 45-year history, they had never had a flood. So they just had never done anything about it. I apologize.
So if you were not in a city or town, but you were in a county, that county would have something going on.
They would have to subscribe to the NFIP and become a qualifying member, which means that they have to allow the National Flood, or FEMA, FEMA and National Flood are really interchangeable, to come in and do a mapping of the area and look at the history of the area, do a topographical survey, and determine whether there are any areas there that would hold water specifically for, an indeterminate period of time without egress, without something for them to go forward on.
I have a question, quick question.
Yes.
So if I am not technically in an area of flood zone where it floods, I can go through my insurance company and request flood insurance for a place that doesn't flood.
You can, let me add to that. Yes, you can. As of right now, there are 26 companies that do the Write Your Own program. In 1983, the federal government allowed companies like State Farm, like us, we use Fidelity. Fidelity's the #2 writer of flood across the country. They'll be #1 soon because State Farm is stopping writing flood. They now they tell their agents to find it someplace else. They won't write it anymore. Nationwide, any of those guys have a Write Your Own program. What the federal government does is it's instituted by and run by the federal government. Everyone's rates, if it's done correctly, are exactly the same. But the federal government allows the companies to go in and collect the premiums before it goes on to NFIP, to underwrite, to make sure everything is correct, and to adjust claims. That's why you can purchase it through any company.
So you can purchase it through any company, but it's really the government program that you're getting it from.
It is there is no difference between Nationwide and Allstate. They're all the same. There's no rate differential. It used to be 10 years ago that you could buy a 3-year program. You could buy a 3-year policy and save about $150. But the federal government went, nah, we're not doing that anymore. So they go year to year to year to year.
Because in Louisiana, when I was in Slidell, way before the hurricane, we were supposedly in a high elevation, so we actually got flood insurance rather cheap.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I'm assuming after the hurricane it wasn't so.
Well, it all depends on, what the map shows. Like I said, there are 3 zones you really have to be concerned about. It's the A and the AE in our area, predominantly V, and CB or X. CB or X may not change. For example, anything along, you guys ever heard the term Pungo Ridge? Pungo Ridge is just it's a natural formation that starts in Pungo and it works its way up to Hilltop and pretty much into Allenton. And it's about an 8-foot rise.
Is that why Hilltop is on a hill?
Yes, ma'am.
That we can't tell, but it,
You can't tell because the roads are so gradient up there, you really can't tell, but it is about 8 feet above base sea level, all the way from Pungo, all the way up there.
So Hilltop's the highest area?
Hilltop is one of the highest areas unless you count Mount Trashmore. Trashmore is taller, obviously, but Hilltop is one of the highest areas in Virginia Beach. And when you get to Norfolk, Norfolk is kind of built kind of crazily. The center of Norfolk.
Well, that's sinking, I've heard.
Well, the fringes are. When you look at like West Ghent,
Yes.
Larchmont area, those areas are starting to sink. They're all trash. I mean, it's a trash buildup. I wish I'd brought it, but there's a 1670 map of Norfolk that makes Norfolk look very small. But over time, they built it up using riprap and trash and stuff like that. So Norfolk has expanded its borders some. But really, when you get to the edges around Willoughby, all the way around to gracious, around the area just to the west of say West Ghent, Larchmont area, it's all eventually going to be sinking in, and it is sinking at an alarming rate.
Right, because an owner told me when we have, not as strong, but a mediocre rain, the water runoff works backwards. The streets get flooded. It just comes in it comes out of the pipe, not really out of the rain.
Well, that has to do with 2 things in terms of flood. It's poor building management because you really should have enough runoff culvert to a duct source that'll push it off. But the issue is, of course, is if you can only go so high on
Right.
the level, and the water it becomes more of a problem going out, it will just back right back in.
Right.
And that's happened a lot in Chesapeake Beach area. I mean, Chesapeake Beach on the Virginia Beach side. It's happened a lot over on Tidewater Drive, off of Little Creek Road. Sewell's
Now,
Point.
for buyers, home buyers, I know a lot of them, they love the Ghent area. Is there like a warning flag or something that says, hey, this area, water goes backwards? Or that's just a
No.
buyer beware kind of thing?
There is a buyer beware. I would recommend that if you're going to have someone look in an area that you suspect might be a flood zone area, call me. I'll do a flood determination for you. Basically, it'll tell you what zone they're in for a good idea. It's not going to be perfect. It's just a determination of what zone they fit in. Now, yes, ma'am.
How accurate do you find the city website to be?
It's fairly accurate. But the problem is where it crosses property lines. Keep in mind that flood, let me use your board here.
which city were y'all referring to?
I'm thinking about Virginia Beach specifically,
Yeah.
but just in general, do you
Virginia
find?
Beach is pretty good. Norfolk's pretty good. Portsmouth, not so good. Chesapeake, they have their moments. The 23320 zip code, which is their largest zip code, they're pretty good at. But you get the 24 or 25 zip code, out there in South Norfolk, I think the guy went out there with one eye closed, but that's just me. All right, let's just say you got a property here that this is the house and street, and there's a stream right behind them. Flood can be one of 3, well, it can be one of 2 on this one, because it's not near the water, it's just a stream right behind it. This is the structure, this is a wood deck right here. If this is in an X or a C or a B zone, it's preferred. Doesn't matter, because this entire property has been mapped and it's showing that it's in one of these three zones, and it'll say there specifically it's on one of these three zones. Beautiful. Doesn't matter, exact same rates. X, C, and B. X is an indeterminate zone. It means that it is either in a B zone or a C zone, and it's just kind of a catch-all. You know, they've done a pretty good, yes ma'am?
What if it slopes down in the back, but it's nowhere near the dwelling? It's sloping down to that stream.
I'll show you that. Here's what you got. You have two different scenarios. I just got on the phone with one of my clients this morning because he thought that he was in an X zone, but the surveyor, they've just built the house and they're doing a pre-survey on it. The survey says that AE crosses right there. AE, the rest of this is in C, but AE. Flood says that no matter what area of the house, it could be right here. It hits the deck, or let's say there's a fence around the property, and it's attached to the house, it crosses right there. If it's got AE with any property that's attached to the house, it's all in AE zone, period, end of sentence. So crossing is a bad thing, and you'll see it a lot, because people built their houses, and especially like what you're talking about off South Plaza Trail. A lot of those houses are built like this, a lot of zone crossings. They could just pass through the corner of the house right here coming off the street because the property slopes down here. Doesn't matter.
So it's you mentioned fence. Is it survey marks or is it actual structure that must? In other words, if it was that corner, I would tell my contractor, hey, could you do me a favor? Could you put in a little angle right there with the fence? I don't want it to be in an AE zone.
That's fine. Then you have to have a resurvey. Because at that point, you need to make sure that you're still out of that zone.
Okay.
So you'd have to pay for a resurvey. It's probably the secondary. It just depends on who it is. Gallup, or usually $100 to $200 for resurvey, so they make sure that it doesn't cross. Now, here's what's happened before. This is where the surveyor marked it because that's what the plot of land did. They didn't look at the latest map, which is 2009 for a lot of these properties, and now it's up here. So you've had him cut this off up here, and he comes back out and says, "Oh well, you know, it's up here."
Cut the corner of your house off.
It's
Who determines?
surveyor. A surveyor will come out and do it. Surveyors are especially trained to know what the zones are.
Yeah. But who determines
think
the
she means-
zone?
yeah.
I think that's what she's. Who
Oh,
determines the zone?
National Flood Insurance Program, FEMA. They do a mapping using, how do I explain this properly? They use a map using like a ground penetrating radar from space, and they map every area, and they do it every 2 to 4 years, depending. The last map we have here that's active, because they said nothing really changed, was 1999, and then in 2009 they started doing a new map.
Now, do we have access to that?
You can go on FEMA's website and pull it off. I will warn you, it is extremely hard to find, extremely hard to pull off, because basically they want to know all this thing, and they'll print it off in this big, huge sheet. Yes, ma'am?
I would say from a liability perspective, we would do ourselves a disservice by being the go-to for that, and we should always just say,
No, I
call
understand
this
that.
guy.
But if we see
But if we see it before we show the house, for example.
For every house that I look at, if I look at it and I go, ooh, this says it could be in a flood zone, even if it says it could be, I would like to do that, because if I can pull that up, I'm gonna tell my buyer, hey, before we do anything else, we need
Well,
to
yeah,
check that
you
puppy
don't want
out.
to fall in love with a house and find out that
Bingo.
Right.
it's a house that was built in the 80s, let's say, 1980s. Here's a horror scenario. 1980s, we just had this one. House built in 1980s. In 1980s, they did not require what's now called compliant venting. If you look at most houses, that every one of them has a vent that's usually within a foot of grade. And that's what's compliant venting. It's got to be permanently open, and it cannot shut. Well, in 1980, they didn't have the same requirements. What they would do is say, oh, well, it's just got to be vented, no problem. And they would put four or five vents. It was mainly for moisture damage prevention. Problem is those could be shut during wintertime. On the back of your little handout here, there is a flood elevation, copy of a flood elevation information sheet, which is what the surveyor has to send. Now, I'll show you what the problem was on this. I want you guys to look at A8. It says, for a building with a crawl space enclosure, provide square footage of crawl space or enclosure. That's A. Very, very bad. Last 2 pages. The first page is let's say that so if you got an average house, let's say it's 2,600 square feet and 1,400 to the bottom, 1,200 to the top. You got to have 1,400 square feet of crawl space underneath there, more than likely. So when the crawl space is in there, it will ask, the next thing is it will ask number of permanent flood openings in the crawl space or enclosure walls within 1 foot of the adjacent grade. Well, in 1987, 88, when this house was built, you didn't have to put them within 1 foot of the grade. So they were totally out of compliance to begin with. They only had 6 vents. Square footage of the vents is 1 square inch for the vent equals 1 square foot of the ground floor. So your 2 must equal or be greater than in your flood vents. So let's say you got 1,400 square feet in the house. You've got to have 1,400 square feet of venting at least. Okay? So what that means is, in a vent, we use a...
No, surely you misspoke, hopefully.
What's that?
You don't have to have 1,400 square feet of vent.
Square inches.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm sorry. 1 square inch
Yeah.
for every
Little
square
breezy
foot.
down there.
Sorry about that. All right, so let's just say this is the house is up here, and this is the crawl space. I'm not an artist. I don't even pretend to be one. This is the grade. There has to be flood vents within 1 foot of the grade right there. Have to be permanently open and enough to cover this entire area. So it's 1,400 square feet. That's 1,400 square inches of flood venting that must be there, permanently open. Now, what this house had was 6 vents. They were not permanently open, and their total coverage was 346 square inches. They're totally out of compliance. What we had to do was send a contractor out there with a Sawzall to cut into that foundation and put new venting in. Why do we do that? Well, because it wasn't within 1 foot of the grade. There certainly wasn't anywhere near enough venting to cover that. And why the NFIP says 1 square inch for every square foot is because less than that, it becomes a swimming pool.
Yeah, you
There's-
gotta put water out.
Exactly. There's got to be enough inches in there to allow the square footage to push that water out.
And don't they have to be within a certain distance of each other,
No,
like around the perimeter of the house?
they do not. They have to be on either opposite walls or as close as, 3 foot in order to match what the government says. But we had to have new vents cut all the way through this house because the rate for this property was over $5,000 a year for flood.
Before they did this.
Before they did that. Because the base flood elevation was at 8.5%, 8.5, and the lowest floor, you'll see it on your thing here, if you look, this is how they get so technical to the point where it can be very, very ridiculous. C2, look at C2, kind of middle of the page, it says the top of the bottom floor, including basement, crawl space, or enclosure floor. That, on this house, was a 5.0. Because it did not have any compliant venting at that point, the house was technically underwater. So what happens is that they said it wasn't compliant venting, it's a -3. We're charging for that, it's $5,000. We had a guy come out and cut vents, it cost him $1,100 to cut the vents in properly, to buy new venting and everything else. Their premium dropped to $560 a year. It's well worth it. But you just gotta know that that can happen. Houses built in the 80s and even the early 90s had that problem. The rules have changed substantially now, and it really is kind of onerous to look at it because they're looking at you guys, and obviously you're not supposed to be flood experts. Well, how much am I going to pay for this flood? I have no idea. We're going to have to find out. So the idea here is that the sooner you can get if it is any house built before 1973, you don't have to worry about a flood certificate because that's before the plan was enacted in Virginia Beach. Norfolk, Chesapeake, anywhere in Tidewater. 1973 or before, they fall into the regular program. They can't qualify for the preferred program, but they fall in the regular program, no problem. It's rated without all this information. Any
So would
house
they have to
built-
put fence and all that to
No.
comply?
No. Any house, like, you know, there are houses that were built in Bay Colony before then, there are houses that were built in Willoughby before then, there are houses that were built in South Norfolk before then. They all qualify for what's called pre-firm rates. And the firm is when they came in and Virginia Beach and Norfolk and Chesapeake all got together and said, let's become compliant, let's be the entity, and at that point, that's when that cutoff starts. So
Pre-firm?
pre-firm rates.
What is the firm? What's that abbreviating?
You know, I can't remember, I have to look it up again, but it just simply means that the flood insurance, I think, management program.
Regional management.
Yeah, I think something like that. It's the flood insurance,
Really
resource
matters.
management, I think is what it
Really
is.
matters.
Really matters.
Yeah, it doesn't, well, anyway.
Are- Is the year, are these things you're telling us right now in here somewhere?
Some are. I'm just trying to give you kind of a general overview of it. But a lot of this stuff is generic stuff. Like I wanted to give you reasons to talk to your folks about flood insurance because it really does cover your behind 9 ways to Tuesday. Because you don't want to get to closing and then have that magic little hey, we need flood insurance and we need it today come up because that can be a real bummer, especially if you got to order the survey and elevation because depending upon the surveyor, it could take 3 weeks to get it out. So, that can
And are
hold.
these rates different, the pre-firm rates, are they?
They are the regular program, and they are different than post-firm. Because they are the subsidized rates for people who had houses prior to 1974.
So
So-
they're
Probably
different
more
than the,
expensive.
Not necessarily. We had a pre-firm, you're familiar with Linhaven Collin? Linhaven Collin, we had a house built in 1972, and they went ahead and got a survey on it, and they found that they were 2.5 feet below basement elevation. So we kind of tossed that baby out, because you really don't want to use that, because it would cost them a ton of money to have, they were on slab, they would have to have JES or somebody come up and elevate the property. So, we used a pre-firm rate, and it was about $1,183. So it was not out of whack. It would actually save them money long term. So it just depends on whether your house is built pre-74 or if it's built post-74. Post-74 always requires a certain.
but those two rates are different. The
They are different.
standard, I mean, I know you can't get the premium, but the standard is even different.
Slightly, yes ma'am. Not by much, but it is more subsidized. Because the older houses are more subsidized than the newer houses because the building requirements pre-74 are much less stringent than after 74 with building codes changing and everything like that. So, does that make sense?
What if they have an addition or do some remodeling or something, what does that do to it?
Well, it can change the deal. It would depend on if they had pulled a permit, which half the people don't do actually, and surprisingly enough. If they pulled a permit, it will change the day. You just gotta do a research on it to make sure that there may not be a flood zone trip. In other words, like I said, it might be that this was the addition that was added on here, and it crosses through that little corner right there. Then you're on an AE. So you would have to have a determination done at that point. If there was a later addition, you probably have to have a surveyor go out and do it to look at it. That happens a lot with commercial buildings. You know, they add on to different things. But we did have one probably about a year ago where Cape Henry Shores is, they had added on a little addition to it, and we had to have a surveyor go out there to confirm that it was still in an X zone, and it was. So that worked out fine, but it just cost an extra $400. But, question, I see a question.
Yeah, I was just talking to her about, going back to the old thing, if there's a map, if it's next to a lake, swamp, anything, or creek, or a rock lake, I look at the back of the house, and if it's in peril, I call, ask questions, and she said, well, even Windsor Oaks, and I said, well, that's what touched me on to you the first time, was Windsor Oaks, because you said that actually changed.
It did.
It wasn't in a flood zone, but.
It was not. It had never been in the history of Windsor Oaks. It had never been in a floodplain per se. It was in an X, or at least, or most likely the flood. But after Norida, 2.5 years ago, they came out and remapped everything, and it went from a BC rec zone to almost all AEs.
But you said that was due, some of it was due to construction.
Due to construction, yeah. The construction management over there was less than adequate to relieve the water. What you had is you had a lot of streets that were built out there, and they put in, if you look across the street down the road in Rosemont, right next to that church there, they put a water reservoir there, which was supposed to help on the bleed off. Problem is that they overbuilt on that so much, and that golf course has a runoff. Bow Creek, which is is that Bow Creek? Which is
Yes.
they have a runoff because they have a higher than average grade. So all the water was just running right into Windsor Woods. Then you get the runoff from Trashmore and all the roads that come down to it because Trashmore is elevated,
Right.
and that's the lowest bowl.
Well, let me ask you another question, and this is due to my experience down in Louisiana. When we adjust the land, a backyard, for example, you think it's too low. The two most highest corners are supposed to be the back left and back right. From there, it's supposed to be graded down towards the house, around the house, and towards the front. Do we have any such things here in Virginia? Because out in Chimney Hill, and some other places, your next door neighbor puts up his yard, adds fill dirt, and the next yard, oh my, it's a swamp anytime it rains just mildly. Are there regulations? Are there things I can tell my buyer?
No, there really aren't. I mean, not unless you're a wetlands issue. Now, if you back up to a lake or a stream or a bay, you can go before the Wetlands Board and request a variance or request federal help to keep that from happening.
So if your neighbor does it, you can't say, hey, whoa, you're adding a ton of land, a ton of dirt.
Can't do it.
And here we don't use French drains as we do in the South so much. We do some places.
There's some, but they're not used as much as they
They're not in fashion.
You guys know what a French drain is?
No, what is
Yeah.
a French drain?
French drain is a water runoff device that basically involves the use of rocks and sand and dirt, and basically runs the water away from the premises, off to potentially a
Sometimes they use PVC.
road,
Yeah.
right?
Over there we
Sock
use,
on.
it's very common to use PVC, and it's just, think about it like a ant kind of a,
Mhm.
and they take sand, because you add a mixture of sand and dirt because water goes through sand, and you angle it towards these pipes in your ground. So, for example, in New Orleans, when it rains for 2 days straight, you go out there 3 hours later, and it's pretty firm, pretty dry, because all the water goes into these 4-inch PVC vents in your front, and they usually go down into two huge ones that go out towards the curb, that goes towards the culverts that we pay so much for that we don't really work as well.
A lot of times you'll see them when somebody's downspout on their house
Right.
disappears into the ground. It's going into a French drain, so it's
Yeah.
taking it
Divert it
away.
away from the
A
house.
lot of those, here's the problem I found with those, they don't go into a French drain. They go into the ground and they end about 20 feet away or 10 feet away, and then that gets filled with ruts and dirt.
Roots,
and,
is that
yes,
like a root?
yes, that's a root, except in the South, you know, us Cubans. But you know, because that's the problem. If you look at a lot of houses that have those for a while, when it rains, water's right there because it's already full of ruts, and
The
that's
correct ones would lead to a French drain.
exactly,
We have
exactly.
them coming off of our house,
Right, you
going
do.
to the back.
Mhm.
Yeah, and but that's what it is.
And you know, it's an expense. A lot of people don't want to take the time or the expense money to go ahead and do that, but it is the wisest choice to get the water away from the house.
I put mine towards a brand new tree, 7-foot Charlie Brown tree, about 1999. It's now over 40 feet tall.
Yep.
The water is great.
What's a Charlie Brown tree?
It started off
It's
really
a $7
wonky.
little tiny little tree, and now it's a sugar red maple.
Shows.
Right.
Lots of roots.
Lots of ruts.
Full of ruts.
I can't believe people don't know about the South. I mean, come on, woman.
I'm from Texas, we're not that far south.
Texas? They do that in Texas.
Carlos,
I know
this
they
is
do,
the
but they
capital.
don't rut.
I've got to correct Carlos. We are in the South. The capital of the Confederacy is right down the road.
You believe that.
All right. Well, getting back to flood, what have you seen out there that really irks you about flood? Just toss me a few things that maybe you just don't know, don't understand.
I thought it was really tacky when they did the V along the coast, because those people already lived there. They had no recourse then.
You talking about all the folks up north?
The
with
rezoning, you mean, when they redrew the maps?
Yeah,
Close to the bay and the,
close to the bay and close to the ocean front.
Well, when FEMA posted a $16.4 billion loss last year, they had to do something, and they had to raise revenue. Unfortunately, what they're looking at is the people who flood the most usually don't pay the most. All along the Mississippi River, most of their rates are significantly less than they are here, because they're heavily underwritten and heavily subsidized by the government.
But how many houses have you heard of along the coast here that have flooded? It's usually along the tributaries inland.
Well, we had
Or the rain runoff.
right. It was the rain runoff. We had probably during Isabel, we had 40 claims for flood,
And
and
they
they
were all in
ranged.
Franklin.
I'm sorry. No, they were all here in Virginia
Franklin?
Beach. They were all on Virginia Beach. We had a couple in Norfolk, and about a dozen in Suffolk, and one in Franklin.
What was the one storm though that dumped it all in Franklin?
That
And
was
we
like
were
a-
all prepared and we didn't get any of it.
And that actually was a storm that started in North Carolina and dumped into the Tar River.
Was that Floyd?
That was part
That's about
of
6 years
Hurricane
ago,
Floyd.
7?
Yeah.
That was it.
No, more than that. It was 99.
It was 98, 99, yeah. And the floods came from the fact that the Tar River couldn't hold its boundaries whatsoever. So all of Tarboro, North Carolina, was inundated, and Franklin just happened to be the back end of that. And the problem with Franklin was that it was all in a Zone C, Zone X up until that time.
Because who'd have thought?
And who'd have thought? And then, of course, the Tar River bridged its banks, and that's all it took. And it was poor maintenance, too. If you look back, a lot of the Tar River issues were the fact that the county, from Tarboro all the way up, had neglected those waterways. They allowed junk to accumulate in there, things like that, which doesn't allow the egress and inflow of water. Basically, once it goes past, because it's a rushing behemoth, it's going to stay there because it's got no way to go back. There's too many obstacles. So keep in mind that it's important that we keep pressing our elected officials to make sure that all drains are cleared, and contact your folks there about stormwater management. All that stuff has to be hard looked at. It's when we neglect those that everybody's in trouble, because it only takes a little while for a Zone C to become a Zone A with floods. Case in point was over there off Presidential Road, Boulevard.
Right.
It's just amazing.
So anytime the bank says, you're in a flood zone and you think you're not, you guys go out there and you make the final determination and say,
We do a determination online. We use two different representatives that look at the topographical map, and they do what's called a FEMA overlay. FEMA has a flood map that's kind of a different color, like this color. And then what you do is you lay a plastic overlay of the map area over top of it, and if the blue lines show through where your area is, you're probably in a flood zone. Then the next thing to do, we're a bad flood zone. Next thing to do is contact the surveyor to go out and do the survey. It's much easier to get a surveyor out there than it is to guess, especially if their house is built after 74, you're going to need them. So, yes ma'am.
Y'all were saying Windsor Oaks. Presidential, I thought, was in Windsor Woods, and he's.
I mean, Windsor
Windsor
Woods.
Woods, yes.
I'm sorry.
But
Yeah,
somebody
because
earlier said
yeah,
Windsor
'cause it was-
Oaks, which is a different neighborhood.
Right,
adjacent.
exactly, I'm
It is.
sorry. That area over there, there are streets that run from one to the other, and when it changes names from Windsor Woods to Windsor Oaks, it's.
Right, but Windsor Oaks is
Right.
newer.
Right, but that's got
Right.
the same problem. They changed zones over there too, because there is no stormwater management over there. They've got no water to run any place. There's, yes,
One
ma'am.
thing that I have learned just in the past 3 weeks that I'm going to start doing as part of my checklist for my contracts, before we put the offer in, before I send any offer, I'm contacting an agent about flood. I'm not relying on what I find online, because it changes too frequently, and I don't want to have my butt on the hook, or my buyer to go, well, I can't afford that, and the deal falls apart. So before any contract is written now for me, I'm checking with an agent that does
And
flood.
Sadly, they don't realize what the cost is gonna be until the bidder ends.
Right, because that
Well,
happened
but
to
at
us.
least if they can tell me it's in an A
Oh,
or
right,
in
but
a
I mean, if
B,
you
or, I
don't
mean,
check,
right,
Right,
you said you don't want them to not be able to afford it, that could be at the closing table.
correct.
right.
Yeah.
And then what are our legal recourse? I don't know that we can get out of a contract
Did-
for that.
Did it close?
Yeah,
Yeah.
It was an extra $2,000 or
Yeah.
so, but,
nobody knew that it was in a flood zone.
yeah.
The plats didn't show anything.
And
Somebody
the
did.
seller doesn't always know.
But you
Well,
said,
when
you
we
said
got to
surveyor.
the-
That's
the
not a
bitter
regular
end,
surveyor,
we
right?
found
That's a
out.
flood surveyor.
No, it's a regular
No,
survey.
Regular surveyor.
Yeah, surveyor will do two things. They'll go out and do a survey on site of the property overall
I don't know.
to determine what zone it's in. And they will create this wonderful little thing that says that here's the survey based on what they've done, do all topographical, where it is, where the NGVD, which I have no idea means. Don't ask me, I have no idea what the acronym means. But they'll tell you all this wonderful thing about your property, and then they'll include the dotted lines. And then they will do an elevation on the property,
Right.
which is the most important thing, because they have to submit that the little form you see at the end. That is the now required form for every policy that has to be written in any state.
Will the surveyor automatically give you a flood cert?
If you have to tell them that you want a flood
But you have
certificate,
to tell them,
tell them you want a flood certificate, you want a survey and flood certificate.
And they will charge.
and if they
An
have to go
elevation
back, they
certificate.
charge you even more than that.
Yes,
Right.
and
You gotta
here's the
tell them
thing.
upfront.
By the time we get to that stage, we paid for inspections, we've gone through several steps where our buyer has paid money.
Mhm.
I don't wanna wait till that to
Oh,
find
no,
out.
No, you're right.
So you're saying a flood cert, you do that, you request that from the seller?
If possible.
If possible. And
But
sometimes-
if
you were
not-
saying sometimes the seller didn't know.
Sometimes the seller
so is it-
doesn't know.
Could it change, like if it was a
It could,
before
sure.
74 house?
Sure,
and then-
and here's the most common occurrence. Let's say you have a seller who's 65 years old. It's gonna be a snowbird fly to California, Nevada, or down to Florida. They haven't required anything of them for years because there's been no mortgage on the house. So if there's no mortgage on the house,
That's the situation we just had.
they,
That's the situation I had.
exactly, there's no way to know.
So that's why, from now on, I am calling before the offer even goes in, I'm calling an agent that specializes in flood and asking them to look it up for me on the most current maps, because I don't trust anything I see online anymore.
How much is a flood cert?
Several hundred
From
dollars.
around $400, from $400 to $500, depending upon the surveyor that you use. But that's
On top of
generally
a
what
survey.
You know what you could do?
Because I was just
I
saying,
don't
as
know
a
that it
listing
would
agent,
fly.
I would ask that, but, I mean, you gotta be pretty sure the house is gonna sell, but I would tell the owner, hey, when we're gonna sell, they're gonna ask for this, and people are not gonna even put in an offer, because it's pretty darn close to a
Right.
flood zone.
And you can do determination for free. Call any agent, and they
Okay.
should do
Right,
it.
that's what I'm talking about, the
do a
determination. I'm
determination
not
for
saying
you.
do a cert before we
All right.
do anything else.
So
Okay.
if they didn't have to have flood insurance and say it flooded, would their homeowners cover the inside stuff?
No.
So they just would be covered?
Yeah.
And
What happens when
sometimes,
that, when, in an area that floods, they don't have a mortgage on the house floods, what is it when they raise their house? Who pays for that? Does
Nobody.
FEMA give them dollars
Well,
towards that?
here's what you can look at. I gave you a little cheat sheet on here. This is the second page in, I believe. No, it's first page in. All right. Between 20 and 25% of all claims paid by NFIP are outside.
What
of
page
the-
you on?
I'm on the first page, very first page. Remember that if you have a flood insurance policy, it will pay for undermining of the structure itself, which is the primary thing that you got a problem with in Pocosin and places like that, where there's repetitive velocity that undermines the property. You've seen them down in Nag's Head, where the waters come and just eating the sand below them, doesn't matter how far the pilings are, they topple over. That's one of the first things they cover. But here's what you got. Federal disaster assistance is what you would have to apply for if you had no flood and you had to jack your house up. We actually had a client in Pocosin. We had their homeowners insurance, but they were not in a flood zone according to FEMA. They were in a B. Of course, that mighty monster Isabel came in and just ate everything away in front of them and ate their entire underpinnings of their house, and they collapsed. They were able to get a bailout loan, small business administration loan, which is how they put it through, for $25,000 for the federal government. Now, they were able to jack the house up and put it right with the 25,000, but they were not able to put a substructure underneath it to lift it up. So it cost them another $56,000, which they had to live in a trailer for 2 years until they could afford that to lift it up. So that's why you want to have flood insurance. Even if you're in a BC or X zone, should that zone change and you not know it,
I was also told, and I don't know if this is accurate, that if you're not in a required flood zone, but you have flood insurance, and you make a claim, from then on, that property now requires flood insurance.
no.
That's wrong. Okay,
Two
good, 'cause that
claims.
made me very concerned.
2 claims, it's called repetitive claims. There's 2 claims within the next 3 years on that property. It has to go in the regular program, and then you have to have flood insurance.
And it's in there in perpetuity.
Forever.
Okay.
Because repetitive claims are not supposed to happen in a 100-year floodplain. The reason they call it a 100-year floodplain is because it's supposed to last 100 years. Now the question is last year the 100 years end, or is next year the 100 years end? You know, nobody really knows. So there's a lot of differential that's there. But the answer to your question is that one claim is not going to kill you. It's the second claim repetitively on that property. As long as, again, you have 2 adjacent properties that are flooded, yeah, it's going to kick you right out of the BC or X zone. You're going to be in an AE from then on. Done. Unless you go back to backfill, raise your house up, and get FEMA out there to remap. There are some things you can do. There's LOMA, which is an appeal basically to them to remap based according to the new mapping and new elevation, and you have to provide all that information. But it's costly. If it's not done in 6 months, it doesn't matter. It reverts back anyway, and it's mostly used by commercial properties.
On your AE levels, is like an AE1 more likely than an AE8 or less likely than, is it?
Most of the time,
8
where it's not going to be an AE1. They'll put that in a BC or X because it's
So
like a
close.
flood. But what you're seeing is usually AE, AE5, AE is 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Those are your
So an 8 would be worse than a 5?
oh yeah,
Okay.
it's definitely worse than a 5 because an AE8 means that the water practically bleeds water. The water just comes up all the time.
Right.
There's some area of the of the property that is so inundated with water, it could be a drought situation, and there will still be a ton of water there, and it's more likely to come on the house and destroy at least the foundation. So that's what it's there for.
What
The
if
other
there's a condo on a bay, so like the condo association covers the outside of it?
Mhm.
Should they have flood insurance
Absolutely.
for the inside?
It's called an RC BAP, and basically what that is it's a residential condo, a building association, and a policy. And what it means is that they buy the master, which covers the structure, but it does not cover the inside walls, it does not cover the contents, and all that stuff. So you would need another policy for that, and it's based on whatever the master is. So the master, let's say for instance Seagate Colony. Seagate is in an X zone. Because it was built such a long time ago, that it actually was built in 1972 to be exact, and I happen to know that they have 16-foot metal spikes that go down below a 16.5-foot concrete base. So, and then there are poles and everything that go actually below that for 40 feet. So it's a pretty solid little deal at the Seagate. And because it's an X zone, anybody who writes a policy qualifies for preferred. Because you come off the master. However, if you're at the condos, there's some yellow condos, and I can't think what the name are right now, that were built by Gallagher or somebody. It might have been Dragas, I'm not sure. They're right there where, pretty close to where the duck inn used to be.
Yeah, those pretty yellow ones that sit back. Okay.
Pretty yellow ones, they're all in an AE zone. So you have no choice. The lender won't lend you any money to get in that condo without having flood insurance. And you will pay the rate of the...
But would it depend on what floor you were on? If you were on the 4th floor or the 15th floor, you would still have to buy the same as the 1st floor?
Because the condo sits as a monolith, okay?
Right.
It's one piece. Should it be undermined to the point where the foundation is no longer existent, then the whole property comes down. And that's where they look at the worst case scenario, is the foundation of that property may be totally undermined, making that building totally
If it's
uninhabitable.
on pilot